Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session at the second Cognitive Automation Summit. I'm delighted to have a conversation today with Suketu Gandhi, partner at Kearney and global leader of their digital supply chain practice on Sense and Pivot with cognitive automation. Suketu is a recognized thought leader and innovator when it comes to digital transformation and has been working closely with us at ERA throughout the partnership with Kearney. Suketu, welcome back to the Cognitive Automation Summit. It's a pleasure to have you again.
Always exciting talking to you, Fred. Always exciting talking to you.
Thank you, Suketu. Last time we spoke during our last Cognitive Automation Summit in September, we were just introducing this discussion around the imperative for resilience and agility in the supply chain. I know this is a topic you've been researching for quite some time. What in the last 8 months, or what have the last 8 months taught us about the need for resilience in global supply chains?
The one big aha that has evolved, and we did not start with a big idea that resiliency is going to fix everything in supply chain across all businesses. We started with a small idea that said, how do you make the supply chain resilient? But as we worked through it and talked to almost 450 companies, what has emerged is that resilience, the way it is thought through, can become a true competitive advantage for companies. So if you want to deliver great business performance consistently and not constantly get affected by demand shocks or supply shocks, this is a way to work through it. And that's what we have learned. So we started with a small idea of resilience and created quite a few data points around it. But then as we toured the globe to understand, virtually, of course, what is happening, this idea has emerged, and it's quite a powerful idea. The best quote I heard from somebody who leads a multi-$100 billion company was that our investment in resilience over the last 2 to 3 years were totally paid for in 2 quarters. And I know they had spent billions on them. To get paid on that in 2 quarters is a really eye-opening experience. So this is a true competitive advantage for long term.
Oh, that's incredible. And certainly, just thinking about the events that we've seen in the last 8 months, obviously COVID continues to be something that we've struggled with as a supply chain set of practitioners around the world. Then you've got events like the Suez Canal situation with the Evergreen. It seems like disruption is more of a constant than ever before. I'm curious, you've been working on this assessment for quite some time, and we've heard that you're launching in the coming months a piece of research with the World Economic Forum. You were incredibly kind to share a preview with us, and I have to say, the results were really fascinating and eye-opening. Any snippets, Suketu, from that research that you'd be able to share with the audience? What have you learned, and maybe what struck you coming out of that research that was counterintuitive to some of that idea that you had up front?
There were 3 things that jumped out. The first was, did not have to explain the word resiliency to anybody. It has become a word that is accepted. But the definition of what it is needs explanation. So basically, the way we have defined resiliency is the ability of a supply chain to respond to well-defined shocks and still operate in a profitable manner. So that's a simple definition that we can all agree upon. The second thing that jumped out was the end-to-end view. Thinking about resiliency in silos of supply chain, whether it's plan, make, source, deliver, does not work. So for example, you might fix your planning function, but because of that, you suddenly find that transportation needs to operate differently, or manufacturing has to manage in small batches versus a large scale manufacturing runs. So thinking about these end-to-end is really critical. And then the third thing that jumped out was, how do you use the power of all your resources? So for example, using your financial strength to ensure that you had stock over a long period of time has worked out for one semiconductor manufacturer really well because it was cheap. They said, hey, let's put the money down. Money costs us very little. Let's make it work. So those are kind of the three things that have jumped out, which truly are now a different way of approaching a customer-backed supply chain.
That's really interesting. I think in the world of supply chain, again, we tend to think of the assets we have in our supply chain as the tangible goods that are moving through the supply chain. You rarely hear about a supply chain practitioner thinking about, the network of the supply chain as an asset, or the fact that you might have bigger cash reserves than your competition and what that can do for you. It's really interesting. And I assume, resilience obviously means different things across different industries. Some industries are more impacted or more severely impacted by supply shocks. Some might be more severely impacted by demand shocks. What were some of the nuances about the differences industry to industry that the research highlighted?
One of the big things were that heavy industries, right, that built to stock. Those industries were focused a lot more on the supply side of the world because they were building to stock. So hence people were gonna come to buy. The industry and those industries had looked at resilience over a longer period of time and had used some interesting techniques, whether it was hedging techniques or long-term buy contracts that allowed them to work through that. But what they had not thought through, and they have started thinking through, was around really understanding with their tier 2s and tier 3s. That was an important element. They were great with the tier 1s, but tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers were an important element. Second, in consumer-driven industries, I would say, people talked about the customer all the time or consumer all the time, but really understanding that the consumer is going to constantly change and now you have to respond to it was not really apparent until they started seeing, right, demand fluctuate massively. I'll give you examples of a non-controversial nature, but puzzles went up in demand by 300%, which is fascinating, right? What happened now? The same way, DIYers really changed what you bought. Nobody wanted a screwdriver, but everybody wanted one that had a lot more power associated with that. And that caused a ripple effect all the way through. So consumer-driven industries talked about the consumer, but now understanding the demand and the variability and flowing that through became really important. And then the third set of industries, which I would call had a combination of hardware and software, industries that had a longer time frame in how people use their product, let's say cars and washing machines and machines that talk, now recognize that, hey, if I listen to the product, I would be able to anticipate it a lot better. And second, how can I simplify my underlying product platform so I can make many things with the same design? It used to be when everything was available, you go, okay, no issue. There's no supply issue. Be as complicated and complex as you need to be. But now that model doesn't work. So reducing your product complexity and increasing your commonality of a product platform is the third element. So these are kind of the three interesting things that we saw that we didn't anticipate going into it when we started the research.
And it's really interesting that you say that. I mean, for one, I can definitely raise my hand and say that I've purchased more puzzles in the last 18 months than ever before. But it's really interesting that you talk about the point of, the product platforms and the commonality and components. I think we've been so driven over the past decade to think about hyper personalization and how can we make our products more tailored to a specific segment. I think we've lost a little bit of sight of what that means in terms of supply chain complexity and not just the cost of proliferating all of those raw materials and all of the components associated with building a product, but to your point, all of the failure points that you now introduce across your supply chain?
You brought up a really important point, which is the failure points. And typically, the failure points have been dealt in the past through a combination of, human intelligence with a little bit of artificial intelligence, not a lot. Now, suddenly, so if you have 10 failures and if you have 100 failures and you have, a large supply chain organization, you have the ability to throw people at the problem. But suddenly, when the number of failures expands, and you find that you're short on 10,000 of inputs that are needed for you to make something, now it becomes a non-human manageable problem. And you're suddenly just flying around trying to find a way, and you can't fly around. So how do you work through that? So that's what is really critical, where the use of technology became an important element. Because I'm sure you want to twist this to technology, since you guys are the cognitive guys.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about technology in a second, Suketu, but I'm curious, as you've been working with clients and deploying this resiliency assessment that you've been working with, what has surprised your clients the most about the state of resilience in your supply chains? What are some of the kind of aha conversations you've had with clients over the past few months where, they would have said, yes, my supply chain is amazing and super resilient, but then you look at the numbers and something sparked and caught their attention?
Nobody claimed that their supply chains were resilient. That's a good part. Only we found was about 12% of folks self-proclaimed that they were resilient, which is wonderful. And they had a great impact on their business performance. The other 88% said, you know what, we were not, and we need to work towards that. So I love the transparency and honesty of it. The second thing that was interesting was the escalation. Now the CEO and the board were asking, hey, what are you doing about resiliency? Because the headline news in the newspapers, whether it was business or non-business, was the drumbeat was pretty consistent. And that was seen as a trigger in conversations around resiliency. And then the third part is the intelligence of human beings came to be recognized again. You asked everybody, and then the one consistent theme was we had great supply chain leaders and people below them who understood our supply chain, and that's why we survived or thrived. Without them, this would not have worked. Now, the 12% that I talked about who were really good, they were able to combine their technology, analytical AI assets with the people. And that's what made for a killer combo.
Absolutely. And I think it'd be tough for any of that 88% to say they don't want their supply chains to be more resilient, especially in light of the last 15 to 16 months that we've gone through. But in concept, easier to achieve than it sounds. As clients look to tackle the issues of resilience, what are some of the barriers or obstacles they face along the way?
The big obstacle has been the siloed thinking, which is the connection between their commercial organization and their planning functions. Mm-hmm. The connection between their planning functions and their manufacturing or third-party views. Their ability to go and work with their third parties beyond the force majeure conversations around, hey, how can I send you insight and you tell me what's possible and when, and how quickly can you respond to it? That was not thought through. And then the last thing is the overemphasis on cost alone. Mm-hmm. Had specifically a trade-off implication on agility and resilience. And that became very clear. So those were the things that those are the things that really stopped them from embarking or moving further on their resiliency journey.
And have you seen some of those conversations, especially, I think the cost trade-off, to your point, has become incredibly apparent. We've solved for lower the cost by sourcing as much as possible through a single contract so that I can get price pressure on suppliers. That's been the mentality of supply chain and sourcing again for the last decade. How has that conversation changed in light of these resiliency discussions?
So we have a concept called value at risk that says if you're not, if you have demand that is fluctuating and you're not able to meet it, and you have supply that is at risk, then when you put them together, it puts your total value at risk as a single number. And that has made the conversation very explicit. If we had unlimited dollars, we would go and fix everything, but we don't. So then how do you make a choice? And what is my optionality in building a supply chain that is truly resilient, but at the same time drives top line and bottom line business performance? That is a very clean way of making decisions, because now we know, hey, am I gonna have to maybe not serve all customers the same way I used to, but let me give them a choice that, I used to come in with 50 SKUs. What if I came in with 35?
Mm-hmm.
Would you be okay with that? And how can you send that to maybe your end consumers and make it work? So the dialogues have become much more richer, much more deeper and granular. And that is the killer piece, we think, in making these trade-offs clear.
And it's fascinating to me when we were having this conversation in preparation for the panel, you've made it a dollar for dollar trade-off, where before it was a dollar of investment against maybe a bit more amorphous of a benefit trade-off, which is super interesting.
Because at the end of the day, right, that's what people understand. That's what the market wants. That's what the board and the CEO wants. So make it explicit, make it clean, and then the chips may fall where they do.
That's super interesting. And I'm curious, Sukhitu, amidst all of the challenges that we're facing with new remote working models, constraints that we still have to work through in our ability to hire and train people in the current circumstances, what role are you seeing data, AI, and cognitive automation technologies, the focus of our summit, playing in making the supply chains more resilient?
The old quote which said, everybody is entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own data. That is an absolute critical part today. So what data has done, it's the great equalizer. So now you know that what is fact and what is an opinion. The second part that has come into play, especially with the deep AI, has been, what are the decisions I can make statistically with a high degree of confidence? So let me move that off the table. And what are the decisions that require a human connect? Because, I looked at demand looks like it's suddenly 30% higher. Is there something happening in the marketplace that is making that skew this way? Should I actually believe the number, or should a human being look at it and then make adjustments? So that's the second part, right? Once you take all the decisions out that are automated, which I know you and I have seen, Fred, somewhere between 60 to 75% can be moved that way. The next, 15 to 20% of decisions will require humans, but now the choice is made of, well, you go this way or that way, right? Do I truly increase my supply, or I'll be okay and this is just a blip? And then the last component, which has gained a lot of admirers in the market today, is the ability to simulate. What if I'm right? What if I'm wrong? Back to the value at risk piece. What will I leave on the table? And am I okay in leaving that on the table? Or I want that, hence I'm ready to, pony up a little more cash for it. So those three things You have the right to your opinions, not your own data. Get the cleanliness of machine decisions with human being, and finally simulate what's possible. Those three things are huge in driving a great supply chain today.
And we've been talking quite a bit about those concepts and our work together, Suketu. I know we're at ERA incredibly excited about our continued partnership with Kearney and the work we've done together to build skills around the concept we spoke about last time, Sense and Pivot. What does your vision for that partnership look like? Where do you see Sense and Pivot heading next in this ability to augment human decision making, automate some of the decisions, and provide that ability to simulate?
The thing is, the wonderful thing about the work we have done together, Fred, is because of your architecture, we are able to plug in skills as needed. So we started with the sensing skills, which was all around demand and supply risk, and see what we do with that. That feeds very cleanly into the areas of planning. And from ERA, it can go into our traditional planning platforms, right, which are good for transactional work. It is moved deeper into distribution, manufacturing. And although sourcing, which has been a powerful function, now you're getting additional insights around risk associated with that. And that's where I see all of these things moving, which is constantly telling you, I see a day where at the end of the day, just like financial services firms, you have a value at risk number that says you are seeing demand of this kind, your ability to supply is this, here are the changes you need to make if you don't want to have a financial impact. And that will change the way we run supply chains. It's a bold statement, but we have seen it together where people who embark on this journey have that as a North Star, and it's reachable. So I am incredibly excited with our partnership because it takes us to a place where you suddenly have hundreds of millions of orders coming through every day and very little human touch to make it efficiently run. But that's the promised land.
And like you said, right, I think the piece that we continue to be jointly extremely excited about is that ability to have, the true end-to-end view of impact and view of risk relative to today's siloed by team or siloed by application view of the world, which, in many cases, everybody's optimizing for what's in front of them and what they've been told their team needs to optimize for, but oftentimes as a result, miss that horizontal connection of, how do I tie my demand risk all the way down to supply resiliency and variability?
Absolutely. And then the last thing, Greg, I'd be remiss if I don't mention is the granularity at which we can make these decisions. It is no more at an aggregate, because at an aggregate level, there are a lot of things that get hidden along the way, right? One product went up 20%, another went down 20. You look at the aggregate, we did okay. But the moment we get at a SKU level, a product level, a customer level, a geography level, a channel level, now you start to see where the differences are coming through and what actions need to be taken. And that granularity comment cannot be understated, because that's how businesses used to operate. They knew their customers, their product, the geography, and the channels before we embarked on an aggregated view where, as in America, there's a great show which would say, in Lake Wobegon, everybody is above average. And we all know that's not a fact.
That's a fantastic show and a great statement to wrap up on. Suketu, thank you so much again for your time and the super insightful discussion. We're thrilled to be able to soon see the joint research with the World Economic Forum. I'd encourage all of you watching to take a look at that research. Really insightful nuggets there about how to think about resiliency in different sectors, and some really interesting findings about where resiliency really plays an incredibly critical role across varying supply chains. So Ketu, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the discussion as always. And thank you all. Hope you enjoy the rest of the Cognitive Automation Summit.
Thank you, Fred.